Welcome to today's webinar, Making the Most of Your Wraparound Fidelity Data, How to Interpret WFI-EZ Results and Put Them to Use. I'm Gary Wonsick at the University of Maryland School of Social Work's Institute for Innovation and Implementation. I'd like to begin with a few housekeeping announcements. So please note that during this presentation, we have a large number of participants who will be joining today, so your phone lines will be muted, though that is the best way to join for the audio experience. So we recommend dialing in, and that information is at the top of the chat box. A recording of today's webinar will be made available in a couple of days. We're looking to have it posted by Friday. This webinar is hosted by the National Wraparound Initiative, a partner in the National TA Network for the Children's Behavioral Health, operated by and coordinated through the University of Maryland. Janet Walker, co-director of the National Wraparound Initiative, will now introduce the webinar.
Thanks, Gary. Hello, everyone, and welcome today to the webinar, which is focused on interpreting and using your WFI-EZ data. I took a quick look at the registration information yesterday, and particularly at the responses that you all gave about what you hope to get out of the webinar. I think what's planned for today will go a long way toward meeting those expectations. I also noticed a lot of familiar names on the registration, and it's good to be here with old friends and colleagues, as well as folks who may be newer to Wraparound. I also noticed we have attendees here from far and wide, including folks from Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and Canada, and lots of places in between. I did just want to note that this is a first for us, that with this webinar, you will have the opportunity to receive CEUs. So at the end of this presentation, watch for the link to complete the post-test and apply for CEUs. Next, please. Just another quick note. Oh, am I doing this live? Okay, there we go. Another quick note before we begin. I do want to encourage you to stay in touch with the NWI by signing up for the letter. After the webinar, you'll get an invitation email that will ask if you're interested in signing up. You just need to click on the link to confirm. The newsletter will bring you updates on research, webinars, key news from the field, and other announcements. And particularly the thing we've been announcing lately is the upcoming National Wraparound Implementation Academy that will be September 11th through 13th in Baltimore. We've had it annually for a couple of years, and it's an event that attendees are really enthusiastic about and get a lot out of. It's also a very popular event, and the latest registration news is that we are already more than half full. So if you're interested in coming, you might want to get on that quickly. If you see is a little tiny picture of the NWI homepage up there on your screen, the orange button up on the right, if you click on that, it will take you right to the Academy information. One other quick thing about the Academy is that we will be having awards for excellence and innovations in Wraparound. So if your program is doing anything that you think is noteworthy, you can nominate it for the award. We'll be keeping the award nominations open through July 7th. All right, so on to the meat of today's webinar. I quickly want to introduce the presenters, both of whom are friends and colleagues from the National Wraparound Initiative and related work. Dr. Eric Bruns will introduce our topic and then hand it off to Spencer Hensley, who is the lead presenter for today. Spencer has been a technical assistant specialist with the University of Washington's Wraparound Evaluation and Research team for more than 5 years. I'm sure that lots of you guys already know him. All right, Eric, take it away.
Well, good afternoon to most of you, and good morning to those of you who are here on the Pacific Coast and in Hawaii. Just want to take 2 minutes as the director of the Wraparound Evaluation and Research team here at the University of Washington to set the stage before handing the controls over to our TA and evaluation specialist, Spencer Hensley. He has a lot of content to cover today in a brief amount of time, and one of the reasons he has so much territory to cover is that measuring anything with rigor and reliability is difficult work. As is using those data to inform important decisions in your system of care or program or wraparound initiative. And measuring quality and fidelity and outcomes of services are no exception. So back at the University of Vermont with John Burchard, we introduced the Wraparound Fidelity Index to the world in the early 2000s. We did this at the time because wraparound was becoming, by the year 2000, a very popular buzzword and very radical and exciting new idea in children's services. But the field was concerned there was really little understanding of the things that actually had to be done at a practice level to get positive results. So programs and systems that wanted to use wraparound to coordinate care for youth with complex needs and their families needed something to help keep them on track and accountable. And we also needed something to assist in conducting research on wraparound, which was just getting into full swing in outcome studies, fidelity, and satisfaction data. As many of you, I'm sure, already know, are also needed to make sure the degree to which, to evaluate the degree to which wraparound was being done as intended and help explain whatever the outcomes were found. So that brings us to today. In 2017, I would say the majority of our Wraparound Fidelity Index user sites now use our briefer, more comprehensive, and more user-friendly self-report measure, the Wraparound Fidelity Index short form, or as we affectionately call it, the WFI-EZ. And as for the original WFI, with the WFI-EZ, we want users of this measure to be full partners and collaborators and take the lead in designing their own evaluation plan, data collection mechanisms, and be full collaborators with us here at the National Wraparound Initiative. And like wraparound, we want this measure and other things that we disseminate to be somewhat locally adaptable and adapted to local needs. We don't want to be overly controlling, as sometimes is a criticism of the developers of other evidence-based strategies. Wraparound really belongs to everyone. We don't want WERT or the National Wraparound Implementation Center to have to collect these data for our partners to make sure it's collected and interpreted correctly. But this demands responsibility on everyone's part. First and foremost on us as disseminators and developers of the measure, and as national trainers and TA providers, as the National Wraparound Implementation Center is, the responsibility is on us to provide information on how to collect and interpret these data appropriately if we're going to make it available for sites to use. The responsibility is also on the part of the users, like many of you are, to collect and interpret the data and use the data appropriately. So that's my attempt to set the stage today. We are extremely excited about the extraordinary community of practice nationally and internationally that we have at the NWI and with respect to our users of our measures. But we want to provide guidance and record this webinar also for use by others who may review it in the future about how to appropriately collect and interpret your data. So thank you for joining us, and I will now hand it over to Spencer.
All right, thanks very much, Eric. And hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. As Eric mentioned, my name is Spencer Hensley. I'm a technical assistant and evaluation specialist here at WERT. And today we're going to talk, as Eric was saying, about one of the fidelity tools that we here at WERT have developed, the Wraparound Fidelity Index, short form, or the WFI-EZ, and especially how to understand and interpret WFI-EZ results. So to that end, we have 4 major goals today. We want to briefly review the tool itself, kind of one piece at a time, its structure and its scoring. We want to review best data collection practices that will ensure that your results are meaningful. We want to familiarize you a little bit with some of the kind of canned summaries that are produced by our data reporting system, WrapTrack, because I know a lot of you use that. And then most importantly, and really what we'll spend most of our time on today, we want to talk about the ways in which fidelity results can be not just kind of collected and stored somewhere, but be understood and really used to inform quality improvement. So this is a lot of ground to cover. And so I'm going to be moving through the material at a pretty healthy clip. so we will be saving questions for the very end. Feel free to go ahead and type those questions into the chat, and folks will be kind of curating those. If we don't have time to get to your particular question today, feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be happy to chat with you individually. Okay, so even as much as we're going to talk about today, this is really only a small part of what is ideally a much larger quality improvement process. So here on your screen we have kind of a simplified generic logic model with inputs and outputs, and you would ideally be monitoring things along this process, kind of in all of the squares to whatever degree is possible. But we're really just going to focus on this middle piece, fidelity. What do your services actually look like? So to kind of reiterate what was presented by this figure, fidelity data will help you understand what your practice is like and make connections to the youth and family outcomes that your families are experiencing. So why is it worthwhile to take stock of your practice? I think it's always good to know what's going on out there, but additionally, in our experience, we see that wraparound teams often fail to do several things that are important or essential to the wraparound process, such as including all the relevant team members, engaging the family or informal supports, monitoring progress, and things like that. We're going to talk about this stuff much more in depth at the very, very end of the presentation, but I do just want to kind of plant a flag here and mention that data collection should ideally be part of an ongoing quality improvement process rather than something kind of collected once and set aside. So we'll talk about that later, but just keep that kind of in the back of your mind, that ideally this is a regular part of your implementation effort. There are lots of ways you could measure fidelity. The WFI-EZ is only one of even our fidelity tools. So we also have a team observation tool, that's the TOM, and a document review tool, that's the DART. So each of these things gets at the question of fidelity to the model in a slightly different way. There we go. And we are now, folks all around the country are using some of these tools, and I see people from many, many of these states represented here today, and we're glad to have you. Okay, so the WFI-EZ, though, what we're going to talk about here is a self-administered survey that can be completed on paper or online. There are 4 versions of the tool. It can be completed by caregivers, youth, facilitators, or other team members. There are 5 sections to the tool, kind of a brief demographics section, a really short kind of basics of wraparound section, a fidelity section, satisfaction, and then outcomes. And we're going to cover these sort of one at a time throughout this presentation. The tool, as Eric mentioned, is based on this semi-structured survey tool, the WFI, that probably many of you are familiar with. And so that went through 4 different iterations before being translated into the current survey form that we use today. And then we have this online data entry and reporting system called WrapTrack, whose interface we'll be looking at for some examples today, just kind of some screen grabs, because I know that, like I said, lots of you folks are using that. And then finally, I do just want to remind everybody that the materials themselves, like the survey itself, is copyrighted, so please contact us if you're interested in obtaining or renewing a license. Okay, so that's sort of the end of the kind of introductory throat clearing stuff. So without further ado, we're going to actually talk about WFI-EZ results. But any discussion about interpreting results needs to begin with a thorough consideration of the data collection process. In many ways, the most important part of data analysis is data collection. Okay, for your analytic efforts to be useful, your data needs to be generalizable. This means that you have to have confidence that the data that's in front of you, the families from whom you collected data, are reasonably similar to the families where you don't have any data, where you don't have any information. And there are kind of 2 critical elements to making sure that this happens, okay? So first, you have to think about who you're going to approach to take the survey, or kind of your sampling procedure. And then second, you have to track who actually is completing the survey or your response rate. So we're going to talk about these one at a time. So let's talk first about sampling. Your sampling approach will depend in large part on the size of your organization and the resources available to you. If you have a fairly small implementation context, like 30-ish families, you may just want to approach everyone for a survey. So often sites that do this administer the survey at some kind of predetermined time point in the life of the family, so like at 6 months of services or something like that. If you're serving a somewhat larger number of families, you'll almost certainly want to draw a sample at some regular interval, like once a year or twice a year. Just select a random sample of families. A random sample is basically what it sounds like. It is just randomly selecting families to receive a survey. So all families will have an equal and known probability to appear in your sample. So for example, if you have a 25% random sample, that means that every single family has a 25% chance of ending up in your sample and being approached about the survey. So a random sample effectively is assuring representativeness, okay? By giving everyone the same opportunity to be in the sample, you're likely to maintain important characteristics of your population, right? So you're likely to get, roughly the same proportion of, say, girls and boys, families who are satisfied, families who are dissatisfied, youth with particular mental health issues or juvenile justice issues, and so on. Without a random sample, you may inadvertently select a group of people who don't maintain those characteristics. All right, so here are 3 non-random ways that you might select people to complete a survey like this. And each of these might cause its own kind of bias. So in the very first example, where a supervisor asks her staff to pick families to complete a survey, staff may feel an incentive to kind of pick the families where the process is working best. Or even if they sort of understand that, they want to be a little more fair than that, they're likely to avoid that one family where things really aren't going well, that one family who's really struggling. And the last example, where a survey is included as part of a graduation packet, you will, of course, miss those families who don't successfully complete services, and they may be different in an important way. In fact, they almost certainly would be. There are some kind of caveats or exceptions to drawing just a simple, true random sample. So most commonly, people will sometimes draw what is called a stratified random sample. That just means that you kind of force certain characteristics to have some proportion. So that, an example may be like making sure you have enough people drawn from all your regions, or making sure you have at least one family from each care coordinator, or something like that. And that's completely fine. There are limits to that kind of thing at the extreme, and we are happy to talk with any of you individually about your sampling procedure. But as a general practice, and for right now, just know that that's totally okay. So that brings us to the second critical element of data collection, your response rate. A sample is only going to be as useful as its response rate. Any missing surveys are going to reduce the representativeness of your data, and they can turn your sample, your random sample, into what sometimes gets called a convenience sample, just kind of, the folks who were available, who were convenient. The families who don't get back to you and don't complete a survey, they may be less engaged in the process. They may be less satisfied with the services. They may just have, more chaotic lives and have higher needs, and so may be different in an important and systematic way. That said, practically speaking, you're not likely to get, absolutely 100% of the families that you approach to complete a survey. So we here at WERT and NWIC recommend a response rate of at least 75% to think of your data as representative. Now, this is not always an easy goal to accomplish. We collect, we sort of oversee lots of data collection efforts here at WERT, and candidly, that's a hard goal to hit, 75%. But a successful data collection effort is going to be one that is well organized and is persistent. Okay? So best practices include things like using a tracking sheet to monitor your data collection, ensuring that families and staff are aware of the process in advance, making calls at various times of the day, like evenings and weekends, meeting families in person if possible. Again, we are happy to help troubleshoot your data collection efforts, though I will say now there is unfortunately really no kind of simple silver bullet solution to data collection. It really does often just take persistence. Okay, so what if you haven't quite done this? What if your data isn't representative, it isn't generalizable? And remember, that means that it wasn't collected from a representative sample, so a random sample or from everybody, a census, and or a significant number of your families failed to actually complete that survey, the families who you approached. So if those things aren't true, you really shouldn't be sharing your results with stakeholders. It's just a little misleading. So that doesn't make your efforts useless. They can be internally useful for kind of planning future evaluation activities, or even kind of making hypotheses about workforce development and quality improvement. It is better than a hunch, but it really isn't appropriate to present data with a really small response rate as evidence, let's say, of like the quality of your practice without including a whole lot of caveats. Okay, so now we're going to go through each of the 5 sections, or well, actually 4 sections. We're going to skip that demographics, but one section at a time. So for each of these, we're going to look at some of the items. We're going to talk about how the results are calculated, how it's scored. We'll try to think critically about what those scores sort of really mean, and then recommend some general approaches for using that information. So first up is Section A. These 4 questions ask about the foundation of the wraparound process. The family is part of a team. That team has created a plan of some kind, a plan of care. That team is meeting regularly, and the decisions that team makes are based on input from the family. So again, these are kind of the foundation of what we think constitutes wraparound. We would hope that nearly everybody is answering yes to these questions. Now, I won't say that we expect literally 100% of families to say yes. Even in a perfect environment, there's bound to be just response error, people misunderstanding questions or just marking the wrong box or something like that. But we do recommend that at least 90% of your families are saying yes to these items. And think that, any instance where a family is saying, for example, that they don't have a team or a plan, is probably worth following up on and investigating. If a significant proportion of your families are marking no on these items, especially those first 2, you may not be consistently implementing wraparound. Maybe sort of important just for this presentation, it also means that kind of the rest of the questions wouldn't have been totally comprehensible to your families because they're asking a lot about teams and meetings and plans. But in any case, that's kind of an opportunity to ask some foundational questions about quality improvement if you're sincerely trying to implement wraparound, but lots of folks are saying that they don't have teams or plans. So that's Section A. Section B, we're going to spend a lot of time here. Section B is kind of the centerpiece or the backbone of the WFI-EZ. This is the fidelity section, okay? There are 25 items, and each of them ask about details of the wraparound process. The items are phrased as kind of statements about the wraparound experience, and a respondent indicates the degree to which they agree with those statements. So, for example, this first one here, B8, at every team meeting, my wraparound team reviews progress that has been made towards meeting our needs. And then a respondent says, I disagree with that, I strongly agree with that, I don't know, somewhere along that scale. I'm sure you've all seen scales and questions like that before. Again, there are 25 questions like this. These items can be rolled up into a single total fidelity score, an overall fidelity score, into 5 kind of subscale scores, or as we call them, key element scores, and then into 25 individual item level scores. We at WERT and NWIC recommend that you examine your fidelity through all of these lenses, that you look at all 3 of these things. So the process of understanding your fidelity is going to be a process from moving from really general down to more specific. You will start with total fidelity for kind of an overall check of your practice, then move to your key element scores to refine your understanding, and then most importantly, look at items for practice level strengths and weaknesses. And then of course, maybe most importantly, actually using that information to inform decisions. So let's start with the first step of this process and talk about total overall fidelity scores. So what is your total score? It is calculated as the average item level score as a percent of like the possible score you could get. So in theory, your score can range anywhere from 0 to 100%. But in practice, this tends to be on the higher end. And thinking about how the score is calculated can maybe help you see why. If you remember, all the items are, at the scale of agreement. And since it's the average of all these item level scores, it's really the average level of agreement that people have with all of those questions. So let's say that every respondent gave the response neutral, that middle item in that scale, if you remember, to every single item. And that probably wouldn't happen, but you can just kind of imagine it for me. That would result in a score of 50%. All right? So this scoring method also treats, it means that the total score weighs every item in section B equally. And all of the statements in there may not be equally important to you. So total fidelity, again, should really only be the first stop in your kind of dive into your fidelity. And, we certainly know that it can be appealing to have this be the number you monitor primarily. All of you have lots of responsibilities, and distilling the quality of your practice into a single number is obviously very seductive, and we understand, but we really do not recommend doing this. Your total score is, again, a good initial check on the overall health of your program. It is going to obscure really important details about your practice. So let's look at an example of how total score hides important details. So here we have 2 totally made-up sites, Site A and Site B. And they each have identical total fidelity scores, 75.1. But their item level scores suggest very different practices. We're going to cover this more shortly, but for now, just know that item level scores range from -2 to +2, okay? So you can see that Site B has sort of fairly middling scores across the board, right? Whereas Site A has quite high scores for most of these items, but very, very low scores for about 6 of them, it looks like. So while both of these sites, again, have the same level of total fidelity, of their overall fidelity, I don't think that their practice is likely to look very similar if you were to kind of sit in on a couple team meetings at these sites. And so I don't think that quality improvement efforts ought to look very similar either. So when you return your total score, or in fact any of the other scores that we're going to talk about, you'll also see in RapTrack a number called a national mean. All right? And I'm going to spend just a little bit of time talking about this number and what it means. So the national mean that we have currently is not a benchmark. They are it's just a comparison. It's a site-level average from a collection of sites who have provided us with WFI-EZ data through RapTrack. So, remember we were talking about sampling before. This is a convenient sample. This is not representative of wraparound around the country. They're generally larger sites. Of course, they're the kind of sites that use that use the WFI-EZ, but they may not be very similar to your site, and they may not be very similar to what Wraparound generally is like. There is no cutoff score that indicates quote-unquote high fidelity. There is no cutoff score that is associated with more positive outcomes. That being said, we certainly understand the desire for something more like a benchmark, and we are sort of slowly working on it. You know, our goals are to create sort of more dynamic national means that can draw from sites that maybe more closely resemble your own particular context. And we are, of course, looking for evidence of associations with particular outcomes. But the lesson here, and if you only take one thing away today, this is not a bad one. The lesson is this. Please don't focus too much on either your total score or your national mean. Comparing your score to the national mean, it's not going to tell you if the process is being delivered to high fidelity. It just lets you know if you're kind of roughly similar to this collection of, you know, comparison sites, mostly large sites from around the country. And then, again, importantly, the total score hides really important details about practice. Okay, so let's look at another example. So let's say that you've run a report to look at your total fidelity score. There it is, your site A. Lo and behold, your score is 75% higher than our national mean. Congratulations, right? That means you're providing high fidelity wrap. Your families must be getting better. You know, let your stakeholders know, take it to the bank, we're done, right? No, of course, at this point, you sort of know a little bit better than that. And so we've provided some sample language about how you might describe a result like this with a little more nuance. If you are uncertain about the language that you are using locally, reach out to us, shoot us an email, and we can talk about it together. Okay, we're invested in making sure folks feel comfortable talking about what their scores really mean. All right, so the next level of detail after your total score are our 5 key element subscores. So the 5 key elements are driven by strengths and families, based on underlying needs, use of natural and community supports, effective teamwork, and outcomes-based processing. These are calculated exactly the same way as the total score, so each of these key elements has 5 items that constitute them, and it just averages together the items within each key element. So that means it has the same strengths and weaknesses as the total score. It's a nice kind of overall view, but it's going to obscure differences between the items. RapTrack will generate a key element report for you where you can compare your scores across different facilitators or organizations, depending on how your RapTrack account is set up. And national means are presented alongside these results as well. And of course, the same kind of warnings or thoughts apply to the national means here as they did to the total score. All right, and then most granularly, you want to look at the actual item level scores. So as I mentioned, scores range from -2 to +2, and it's worthwhile to think about, again, what those numbers sort of mean. They represent the degree of agreement that all your respondents have with a given item, the sort of average level of agreement. So a score somewhere between +1 and +2 means that your average level of agreement, it's kind of like measure of centrality, is somewhere between agree and strongly agree. A score between -2 and -1 means that your average score would be somewhere between, or your average agreement, I should say, would be somewhere between strongly disagreeing and disagreeing with that statement. Again, there are some canned reports in RapTrack that will summarize your results. So here you can see just a simple item level average scores. They're grouped here by the key element of those items. And then one other report out of RapTrack that's at the item level is going to highlight some strengths and some areas of improvement for you. These are items where your site score is more or less than 40% of a standard deviation from the national mean. And if you're not quite sure what that means, that's okay. But what's important is that it means the report is only highlighting relative strengths and weaknesses. So in other words, are you higher or lower than the other sites in our national mean? But it's probably also a good idea to look at your kind of absolute strengths and weaknesses. You know, some items may not be a weakness relative to our national mean, but nevertheless worthy of your attention. So, you know, for example, most wraparound implementations struggle at least a little bit with engaging and utilizing natural supports. That's a hard thing to do. And as a result, the score in our national mean is somewhat lower. So even if this were a fairly low score at your site also, it may not show up on that previous report. So a nice, simple strategy here is to simply rank all of our item level scores from highest to lowest. Now, unfortunately, at this time, there is no way to automatically do this in WrapTrack. You would need to export your data, kind of calculate, you know, get the average for all of those items in section B, and then sort them in Excel. If anybody is interested in doing this and needs help, you can let us know. It really shouldn't take more than a few minutes, and I'm sure one of us would be happy to just quickly show you how to do that. For this and for related reasons, it is a good idea to learn how to export your data out of WrapTrack. The reports that WrapTrack produces are useful, we hope, but you know, for the maximum flexibility, it can be important to just get your hands on the raw data and feel like that's available to you. So this is pretty easy to do. You just click on the menu here at the top, and then you navigate to export data, and then you'll get an Excel file that looks kind of like that one in the bottom left-hand corner. And once you've got comfortable with exporting your raw data, again, a simple rank of your items from highest to lowest can produce a lot of information. So here is just one example of how you might present that kind of information, where I've just pulled the 5 highest and 5 lowest rated items, and then placed their scores in little tables next to the text of the item itself. So here you can see, again, it's not just your relative strengths and weaknesses, but kind of, you know, absolute, like relative to your own scores. Okay. So we have thus far talked a bit about how to understand what your data means and a little bit about how to get it into a form that you can work with. But we haven't talked too much yet about what you would actually ask of your data in the first place. The specific questions that you're going to ask are going to be unique to your context. And so it's hard to be too specific here. But at the very broadest level, what you'll tend to do is look for patterns. You'll have almost certainly some kind of analytic group that you'll be comparing, and so that might be groups of facilitators or supervisors or organizations or counties or time points, you know, last fiscal year compared to this fiscal year, something like that. But whatever those groups are, you'll just tend to look for 2 kinds of patterns. You'll want to ask what items are scored either high or low for absolutely everybody. This is kind of a global pattern to notice. And then what items are scored either, you know, very high or very low for only some of your analytic groups. This is something that's, you know, more local in some way. When data is more granular, though, you do need to interpret it with some caution. So this is especially the case if you're looking at the scores of individual care coordinators. You'll just want to pay close attention to the number of surveys that are making up, you know, whatever average score you're looking at. You know, if you've collected data the way that most sites do, you'll have lots of surveys, and it will be fairly representative at the scale of like an agency or a county. And it'll be much less so at the scale of a care coordinator. So the one family that happened to fill out a survey for this care coordinator, that may or may not be very much like what most of her services are like, what most of her family's experiences are like. Okay. So now we have one kind of last set of example data, or actually it's the same set as before. So you remember our example of the total score, which was 75%, higher than our national mean of 72%. And so here we have the key element scores that make up that number. The blue are your scores compared to the red national means. So we can see that our natural support score is our lowest score. It's both like our lowest score, like relative to our other scores, and it's also the lowest relative to the national mean. There's kind of the biggest gap there. While our strengths and family-driven score is our highest score, again, both overall and relative to the national mean. So as we're starting to kind of piece together the story of our fidelity in our heads, it seems as though we maybe struggle to include natural supports, but are quite good at being strengths-driven. At least that's sort of a hypothesis to work with for now. But let's clarify that a little, or add a little nuance to that by looking at our actual items. So let's start by looking at that low-scoring key element, natural supports. So if you read through those items, you can see here that the first two items are sort of about the kinds of supports that families are able to build thanks to the wraparound process, not so much what's happening inside an actual meeting. And the scores here are actually pretty high, despite the low key element score. Next, we have two items that are most directly about the inclusion of natural supports, like friends and extended family members, on the team. Now, the scores here are low-ish, but they're not too much lower than the sites who make up our national mean. This is, like I said, something that folks everywhere struggle with at least a little bit. But it's this final item that I really want us to pay attention to, because this is the item that seems to be driving a lot of our low key element score. This is an item about the inclusion of sort of informal strategies. Now, this is obviously related to the inclusion of natural supports on your team, but it isn't precisely the same thing. And had we just stopped at those key element scores, had we stopped at that last figure, we might have missed this nuance. We might not have kind of targeted our efforts in the way that they may be most needed here. And then even though we scored really well, let's also look at that strengths-driven key element in some detail. So we can see here that 4 of the 5 items, the kind of second 4, or the last 4, are scored extremely high, much higher than the national mean. And that suggests that many of these practices probably are real strengths of our program, and that's great. But you will notice one exception, that very first item. This is an item about families selecting the people who are on their team, and so that probably underscores the same kinds of issues that were at play in that lower natural support score, and again, something that you may have missed without diving into these actual item level scores. So here again is some sample language for reporting purposes, describing key element scores and kind of particular strengths and areas for improvement of practice on an item level. All right, so that's it for fidelity. Caregivers and youth complete a short satisfaction section. There are 4 questions, each with the exact same response scale as section B, strongly agree to strongly disagree. But if you read through these items, you'll see that they're not really all equally related to satisfaction. The first 2 are kind of most directly about satisfaction with the process, while the second 2 are a little bit more about progress made so far. So for this reason, we really think that it's a little bit better to look at item level scores than to calculate kind of a total satisfaction score. You should, in general, expect relatively high satisfaction scores. Across all kinds of services and industries, people tend to say that they are satisfied with things. People like to be nice. People like to be appreciative of the work of others. And so unless they have like a specific active reason to say that they're dissatisfied, people tend to give kind of higher marks. And then finally, caregivers and facilitators are given a series of just brief questions to track some real simple outcomes. So there are two different sections here. The first one asks about objective system involvement. So has the youth been to an emergency room for a mental health problem? Have they been expelled from school? Just simply yes, no questions. And then the second section is only asked of caregivers, not facilitators. And this is about kind of the impact of problems on the youth's family life, school life, social life, and so on, a little bit more subjective. The systems involvement outcomes, that first section, are going to vary really widely from one community to another because they're likely sensitive to a whole lot of variables outside the wraparound process. So, for example, in our national sample, the national means, the percent of youth who have been expelled from school ranges from 6% up to 37%. And there's probably a whole lot of things that influence that aside from what team meetings are like. So determining what constitutes a quote unquote good outcome is going to be a pretty local decision. So talk to your stakeholders, focus on change over time, and use outcomes to highlight systems level interventions are kind of the recommendations that we can have sort of in general to everybody. Okay, so I know that we're flying through this, but the last thing that we want to cover today is really the most important. We've talked so far about how to collect your data, how to understand what your data means, how to summarize and slice your data, but we haven't talked about how data fits into your broader implementation efforts. And ideally, data collection and analysis is not some separate and siloed effort, but is integrated into your larger work, is helping you understand what is going on and make decisions about what to do next. So we want to encourage you to use data as part of a continuous quality improvement orientation. Some of you may have seen something like this, like described in terms of a plan, do, study, act, or plan, do, study, adjust cycle. So the framework here, the idea here is that this is a continuous process where you make hypotheses, you initiate changes, and then you track progress and make adjustments. So, fidelity data, unfortunately, is not all that often going to yield you a kind of simple, obvious, silver bullet solution. And I think a lot of us kind of expect this in the back of our minds. I mean, I do too, frankly, that if we collect data, we'll have a single clear answer to what's going on and what to do next. But this just doesn't always happen. Instead, the kinds of information you get back have to be provisional because there's lots of churn in your staff and in your families, and your context changes, and data's a little diffuse in what it means, and so needs to be adjusted over time. And so this is a process that kind of understands that that's the reality and tries to use data within that context. So let's kind of go through an example of this together. So let's say that based on your WFI-EZ results, but not only on your WFI-EZ results, because you have other sources of information, including just conversations with your staff, observations you've seen, things like that. But you've kind of picked up that the use of natural supports may be low. So you plan to address this. You want to conduct a training on natural supports, and you decide to focus on engaging natural supports during your supervision sessions. So you go ahead and you implement these changes, right? You hold that training, you change your supervision style for a little while, but you can't kind of stop just there. You want to see, is that actually working? Are we having the intended impact? So, once you've implemented your change, then you would go back and collect some more surveys, maybe a year later or 18 months later or whatever is reasonable for the change that you've made. So you take your random sample of caregivers, you get your high response rate, and you learn that you have been successful, that natural supports are now joining your team meetings much more often. But it seems as though your services are still mostly formal in nature. You don't have a lot of informal strategies and supports on your plans of care, for example. So then you adjust. You adjust your supervision or maybe your training to emphasize that natural supports should not only participate in meetings, but also be tied to strategies to help the transition process and make sure it's a sustainable model. And then you would essentially kind of go around this circle every year or so as necessary to continue to make sure your practice is improving. Okay, so that's all we have for you today. And I know that was a lot. If you are interested in learning more, if this was interesting to you, consider joining us in Baltimore this September at the National Wraparound Implementation Academy. This is what Janet was talking about at the very top of the presentation. Evaluation and quality improvement is going to be just one of several high-quality, fascinating tracks that you can join. So I hope that we will see some of you there. Again, the slides and resources will be available here. Gary was saying that they're hoping to do so by Friday, but certainly not before too long. And then here's some information about CEUs. I believe when this webinar ends, though, you're going to be automatically taken to the link here. But please let somebody know if you have trouble with that. So I think we have, I don't seem to have any other slides. I think we have some time for questions. So we have about 7 minutes, but I'm happy to stand a little longer if necessary. Who has some questions?
Well, Spencer, you did a great job. This is Eric. And thankfully, Gary and the Institute have been compiling the questions. So let's try and get through them, and then we can, folks who want to stay on past the top of the hour can do so for a few minutes to get any individual input or additional input. First question we got, and I'm not 100% sure what the inspiration for this question was from the webinar, but one person wrote in and asked, does this mean that the connection between fidelity and outcomes hasn't been determined? Again, not 100% sure what prompted that question, but collecting fidelity, my quick answer is collecting fidelity data for your own quality improvement is, needless to say, something that should be undertaken regardless of what formal research has determined. So much greater, even greater rigor than what Spencer's describing here is needed to try to establish that kind of connection. You need to follow all those rules that Spencer said about good data collection, representative samples, and then you also need to undertake analyses that allow you to reliably or rigorously, systematically determine the association between outcomes and fidelity scores. There have been several studies published that have found that overall, at both a youth/family level as well as at a site level, there is a association between the level of wraparound fidelity and the rates of more versus less positive outcomes that are achieved, particularly at the program level. So knowing the degree to which any individual wraparound initiative or program is achieving this higher versus lower fidelity, and then associating it with the outcomes that they're achieving overall. So for example, the rate of prevention of out-of-home placement or the relative amount of positive change on a standardized outcome measure seems to be associated with the overall fidelity scores for wraparound initiatives. So that has not been so that association has been found. It doesn't hold up in every organization or state, or certainly not for individual families, because as Spencer said, families' level of satisfaction and outcomes is dependent on so many things beyond just wraparound care coordination. But we have found that trend at a program and system level. Other questions that I can answer, and then I'm going to hand it over to the experts on the actual measure and wrap track. Yeah, actually, almost is there going to be a webinar about the TOM? I think that we could do that if folks think it would be useful. We might not do it in a webinar format, but perhaps we could do a similar overview in a kind of video and then post that in our resources on the NWI. So that's a great question. One next question that I might have to hand to others is, let's see, where was that one? Someone asked about whether or not national means are available beyond just caregivers and beyond just key element scores. Spencer or April, can you address that question?
Yeah, so there are different national, it's a good question. There are actually different national means for each of the respondent types. So you would get a different national mean if you were looking at your facilitator surveys as compared to your caregiver surveys. And there should be item-level national mean scores. If for some reason those aren't populating into a WrapTrack report, let us know, but we could provide you with those in a worst-case scenario.
Okay. We answered through the chat that the WFI-EZ is available in Spanish, but I don't know about the reports. I don't think there's any tailoring of the reports so that the reports will be generated in Spanish. Is that correct, Spencer or April?
I believe that that's correct. I don't think April's on actually, but no, I don't think that the reports are available in Spanish, but that's, we can certainly put that on our list of worthwhile things.
Right, so we can administer the WFI-EZ in Spanish online or by paper format, but those who use WrapTrack to create reports may have to use the English wording of the same items, of all the items that have been translated into Spanish. Let's see. Can you confirm that the negatively worded questions are reverse-coded and presented in the strengths and weaknesses based on that? And the answer to that is correct. The strengths and weaknesses scores, as well as the profile of item scores, would be presented in the same direction to facilitate interpretation, I believe. Is that correct, Spencer?
Yeah, that's right. There are about, I think there are 5 or 6 negatively worded items on the survey, and all the reverse coding does happen automatically in WrapTrack.
Thank you. Are we able to export raw data using Internet Explorer? I tried to do so in Excel in April and was told exports work best with Chrome. Has this issue been resolved? And I have no idea the answer to that question.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, but we can check in with our developers and see what the deal is with that.
Yeah, we do know that for that this has been a consistent issue, that using Chrome is going to get you the best results in using WrapTrack. I don't know if that's been addressed yet. If we don't use WrapTrack and enter data manually, how can we produce reports? And I think the same person said, I mean manually in Excel or SPSS. I don't believe we have any scripts at this point for the WFI-EZ to do that because most folks do use WrapTrack, but I can hand that again to Spencer to answer.
Yeah, we don't have anything kind of pre-packaged that would kind of do that automatically for you. The WFI-EZ manual at the very end of it does have all of the kind of scoring formulas written out, just kind of in sort of plain math. It's not in any kind of coding language, but that would be a good resource if you were trying to do something like that.
Right, and if you do decide to do that because for whatever reason you want to maintain your own database, then feel free to share what you learned or what you created. April suggests we may have syntax, so we can get back to that specific user if you want to just write to our wrapeval@uw.edu. You can ask that question specifically and we can respond to you about that. So yeah, our email here is wrapeval@uw.edu. You can also find that link on our website. And April just put that up on the chat box. Let's see, what else do we have here? The hyperlink to the training center for CEUs generates an error message. So I don't know if Gary has an answer to that one. for us?
Yeah, I'll look into it, and we're going to be emailing all the participants and all the registrants once we have the recording posted. And since there was a lot of information covered today, it might be good to wait until the recording's posted along with the post-test so that you can have one handy to help with the other. And so we'll send that out by email.
All right, thank you very much, Gary. Let's see, Is there any evidence of effectiveness of wraparound being used with other populations outside of youth and families? So for the person who asked that question, a little bit outside of the realm of this webinar, but happy to answer it briefly. It's important to recognize that wraparound is just one specific defined model of care coordination for individual or integrated care for individuals with complex, for youth in particular with complex behavioral health and other needs. There's a ton of evidence for the positive effects of care coordination for adults, but wraparound, as is promoted by the NWI and defined by the NWI and supported by the National Wraparound Implementation Center, has not really been applied very widely with other populations beyond youth. There is some evidence from a couple of evaluations that it could be very effective. So John Vandenberg and Jim Rast applied it to the transition of adult prisoners back into society and found that the reincarceration rate was much lower when wraparound was used as a mechanism to reintegrate those prisoners. So there's plenty of, I think, common sense as well as some evaluation results that suggest that this specific type of care coordination could be useful for other populations. But I think that the main sources of evidence you want to look to are the broader integrated care and care coordination literature. Let's see, anything else? Have I missed anything, Gary, or others who are tracking our questions? I think we might have gotten to them all. So we're only 4 minutes over. Thanks for those of you who are still with us hearing the answers to those questions. We'll give you one last second to send any other comments or questions. And if we don't see any, then we will invite you to indeed find that email from the Institute for follow-up around CEUs, post-tests, etc. And really thank you, especially those of you who are collaborators, for joining us today to learn more about how to use your data as effectively as possible. Anyone else want to sign off with any last words among our presenters?
Yeah, I just say thank you everybody for joining us today. It was good to see such a high turnout and so many kind of familiar names. And again, please don't be shy to reach out to us, even to just help you think through some of these things.
Yeah, and given what I'm seeing is a lot of good positive feedback and the number of attendees, we probably will be doing more of these in the future. So keep an eye out, and hopefully we'll